Okay, so you think you know Samsung. You've got a Galaxy phone in your pocket, or a Samsung TV mounted on your wall, or you just know it as that massive Korean tech company that makes basically everything. The logo is everywhere. The products are everywhere. You walk into any electronics store in any country on Earth, and Samsung is staring back at you from every shelf. And from the outside, it looks like a pretty straightforward story. Big company, good products, enormous scale, lots of customers, lots of money. That is almost entirely wrong. Or at least, it's so incomplete that it might as well be wrong. The Samsung most people recognize is the result of something far stranger and far more aggressive than great product design. It's the result of decades of calculated capital allocation, vertical integration pushed to an extreme that almost no other company has ever attempted, and a willingness to bet billions of dollars on bets that looked insane at the time. And the surprising part is that the Galaxy phone in your pocket isn't even where Samsung's economic story gets most interesting. Let's start at the beginning. Because Samsung wasn't born in a laboratory or a garage. It was born in a fish market in 1938. A man named Lee Byung-chul founded Samsung in Daegu, South Korea. Not as a technology company, not as an electronics manufacturer, as a trading company that exported dried fish, noodles, and local groceries to China and Manchuria. That was the business. Buying things cheap, selling them somewhere else for more. The early model was fundamentally about distribution, arbitrage, and spotting what people needed before they asked for it. That origin matters more than most people realize, because the economic philosophy that Lee built into Samsung from day one, diversify, always be looking for the next opportunity, never get comfortable, became the DNA of everything that followed. Long before it manufactured a single microchip, Samsung had already expanded into textiles, sugar refining, insurance, securities, retail, and construction. In South Korea, this kind of sprawling family-owned conglomerate is called a chaebol, and the structural logic is brilliant in a specific way. Cash from profitable divisions funds risky new ventures. If one business gets hit by a downturn, others absorb it. Capital flows where opportunity is greatest, which raises an obvious question. Why would a company this diversified, this comfortable moving across industries, eventually decide that manufacturing electronics, specifically semiconductors, was worth betting everything on? The answer starts in 1969, when Samsung established its electronics division. But the truly transformative decision came in February 1983, when Lee Byung-chul stood in Tokyo and made what became known as the Tokyo Declaration. He announced that Samsung was going to mass-produce DRAM chips, dynamic random access memory, the foundational ingredient inside every computer on the planet. The global reaction from the semiconductor industry was not concern. It was laughter. Intel scoffed. The established players dismissed it as delusion. South Korean engineers manufacturing advanced memory chips? The idea seemed almost comic. At the time, a single semiconductor production line cost roughly $940 million. That wasn't just expensive. That was a commitment of the entire conglomerate's financial reserves, with no guarantee of return and very little technical foundation to stand on. And it gets more dramatic than that. Because Samsung didn't have the technology, so engineers did something audacious and legally questionable. They reverse-engineered chips from Micron, memorizing circuit designs by day and drawing them from memory at night. They built a functioning fab in 6 months. The standard timeline was 18. There were no shortcuts in the physics of manufacturing chips, but there were shortcuts in the organizational physics, in the willingness to outwork, outsleep, and out-obsess every competitor. Only an almost irrational willingness to endure every constraint produced a fab that the industry said wasn't possible. What Lee was buying with that risk wasn't just a factory. It was a lesson in economies of scale that would compound for decades. Here is how economies of scale actually work, and why they are so difficult to replicate once a company establishes them. Every factory has fixed costs: the building, the equipment, the debt service, the engineers who keep the machines running. Those fixed costs exist whether you produce 1 chip or 10 billion chips. So the more you produce, the smaller the share of fixed cost allocated to each unit. Lower per unit cost means you can price more aggressively than competitors, win more customers, sell more volume, and spread fixed costs even further. The flywheel becomes harder to stop with every rotation. More production, lower costs, more competitive pricing, more sales, even more production. But Samsung didn't just use scale to sell more of what other companies were already selling. It did something more fundamental. It made the components that other companies needed to build their own products. And that distinction between a company that assembles technology and a company that manufactures the foundational ingredients of technology is the entire story of why Samsung is so economically powerful in a way that most people never actually see. Because when most people think Samsung, they think phones, maybe TVs, and they are describing a tiny fraction of what the company actually is. Samsung operates four major economic engines. The Device Solutions division handles memory and logic semiconductors, DRAM, NAND flash, advanced logic chips. The Device Experience division covers smartphones, consumer electronics, TVs, and network systems. Samsung Display Corporation manufactures OLED screens. And Harman, an acquisition Samsung made in 2017, handles automotive electronics and premium audio. Now look at what those divisions actually generated in 2024. The DX division, all the phones and TVs and appliances, brought in roughly 174.9 trillion Korean won. The DS division, the semiconductors that consumers never see, brought in 111.1 trillion. Samsung Display added another 29.2 trillion. Harman contributed 14.3 trillion. The realization this produces should reframe everything you think you know about the company. Samsung isn't just competing in the technology market. It supplies the technology ecosystem itself. When Apple sells an iPhone, Samsung may have produced the memory inside it. When a server farm runs AI models, Samsung's chips may be doing the work. The company profits even when its direct competitors succeed. And nothing illustrates this more clearly than the semiconductor division. Building a semiconductor fabrication facility, a fab, cost anywhere from $15 billion to $30 billion for a modern advanced node. That number is not a typo. Per factory. And those factories require constant upgrades because chip manufacturing technology advances so quickly that equipment becomes obsolete within a few years. That entry cost is what makes the semiconductor market an oligopoly by default. You cannot bootstrap your way into chip manufacturing. You cannot iterate cheaply. The barrier to entry is measured in the kind of capital that only governments and the largest corporations on Earth can access. But once you have the factories, the expertise, the customers, and the supply chain, the economics flip in your favor dramatically. Samsung, at its scale, produces chips with a cost efficiency that competitors without comparable infrastructure simply cannot match. The problem is that chip markets are brutally cyclical. High demand creates shortages. Shortages push prices up, profits surge, companies flood capital into new capacity. New capacity comes online, supply overwhelms demand, prices collapse, inventory piles up, profits disappear. Then the cycle begins again, and Samsung, with its enormous fixed cost base, feels every trough with maximum severity. Which leads directly to the question of why Samsung never stops spending. In 2023, Samsung was in the middle of one of the worst semiconductor downturns in years. Operating profit had collapsed by 85% compared to the year before. And yet, that year, Samsung spent 53.1 trillion Korean won on capital expenditure. The following year, spending expanded to 53.6 trillion. Not because the short-term returns justified it, but because stopping would be more dangerous than continuing. Technology companies cannot live off yesterday's factories. Moore's law means your manufacturing process is always getting beaten by someone pushing the next generation. If Samsung pauses, competitors advance. The fixed cost burden of yesterday's factory becomes a competitive disadvantage rather than a moat. So the spending never stops because the alternative is slow irrelevance. This is also why the component businesses matter so much more than the phones. If you enjoy the kind of deep economic analysis we do here, now's a great time to subscribe and hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people find this content. When a consumer buys a Samsung Galaxy phone, they see a sleek piece of glass and metal with a camera and a screen. What Samsung sees is fundamentally different. It sees a chip it manufactured, a display it produced in its own panel factory, a memory module it made in its own fab, components assembled in its own facilities, distributed through its own logistics infrastructure, supported by its own software layer, sold under its own brand. Every layer of that stack that Samsung owns is a layer where it captures margin that a pure assembler would have to pay to someone else. Ask the wrong economic question about Samsung and you get a misleading answer. The wrong question is, how much does Samsung make selling a phone? The right question is, how many different points in the technology supply chain can Samsung extract value from before a phone reaches a customer's hand? Vertical integration, when it works, doesn't just reduce costs. It converts the same physical product into multiple revenue events across the same corporate umbrella. But Samsung's entry into smartphones wasn't simply a natural extension of its component business. It was a gamble of a different kind. When the smartphone era began in earnest, Samsung entered a market governed by entirely different economic physics than chip manufacturing. You weren't just competing on cost efficiency and manufacturing scale, you were competing on design, software experience, marketing, distribution relationships, brand identity, carrier partnerships, and the ability to make consumers emotionally attached to a rectangle of glass. The costs in this world are front-loaded and brutal. R&D for a flagship device runs into billions before a single unit ships. Then the phone is released, peak sales last maybe 12 months, and then it's obsolete. To make that math work, you need enormous volume. Samsung needed to sell tens of millions of units per device to spread its fixed development and marketing costs across enough units to generate profit per phone. So Samsung did what Samsung always does when a market is too big to ignore. It dominated through variety. Instead of selling one phone at one price point, Samsung built what the industry calls a product ladder. Entry-level devices targeting budget buyers in emerging markets. Mid-range devices for the price-conscious mainstream. Premium flagships competing directly with Apple for affluent consumers. Specialist devices for tech enthusiasts who want the best camera or the best screen. And now, foldable phones for early adopters willing to pay a substantial premium for novelty. The economic logic is market segmentation. Occupy every price point so competitors have nowhere to build a foothold. The hidden cost of this strategy is complexity. Dozens of SKUs mean fragmented supply chains, diluted marketing budgets, complicated software update cycles, and inventory management across price points and geographies that would give most operations teams nightmares. Which brings us to the most useful comparison in technology. Samsung versus Apple. This is not a phone fight. It's a comparison between two fundamentally different economic architectures. Apple builds its power through premium pricing, an ecosystem so integrated that leaving it costs the user something real, a services business that generates high-margin recurring revenue, and a brand identity that allows it to charge a price premium even when the hardware specs are comparable to cheaper alternatives. Samsung builds its power through manufacturing scale, component production, hardware breadth, and capital investment that competitors cannot easily replicate. Apple extracts lifetime value from a carefully curated base of affluent, loyal customers. Samsung extracts margin from the physical supply chain of the entire technology industry. One model optimizes for revenue per customer, the other optimizes for value captured per component. The question of which is more economically powerful doesn't have a permanent answer. It depends on where you are in the technology cycle and which layer of the stack is commanding premium margins at any given moment. And Samsung's vertical integration creates advantages that go beyond cost reduction. When Samsung owns the display technology, it can put OLED screens in its own phones before any competitor can source comparable panels from third-party vendors. When Samsung owns the memory manufacturing process, it controls its own supply chain during global shortages that cripple assemblers dependent on outside vendors. When Samsung's engineers work in adjacent divisions, chip designers next to phone engineers next to display engineers, the speed of product development and the ability to co-design across the stack produces devices that a pure assembler cannot replicate at the same cost or timeline. But vertical integration is not automatically profitable. And this is where Samsung's model carries genuine structural risk. Owning factories means owning fixed costs. Software company scales with near zero marginal cost. Samsung scales by building buildings, buying $100 million machines, and hiring armies of specialized engineers. When demand is strong, those fixed costs are distributed across enormous volume, and the economics are spectacular. When demand weakens, the factories don't stop generating costs. The machines still depreciate, the engineers still draw salaries, the debt service still accrues. And that creates the defining paradox of Samsung's economic model. The very asset that makes Samsung dominant during a boom becomes a financial burden during a contraction. The numbers are not abstract. In 2022, Samsung's operating profit reached 43.38 trillion Korean won. In 2023, amid a semiconductor glut triggered by post-pandemic inventory corrections and reduced consumer electronics demand, operating profit fell to 6.57 trillion. That is an 85% collapse in a single year. The factories that had been Samsung's greatest competitive weapon were now running below capacity, generating depreciation expense on assets that weren't producing enough revenue to justify their balance sheet value. This cycle is especially severe in memory chips specifically, because of how the memory market is structured. DRAM and NAND flash are commodity products. Unlike a luxury smartphone or a custom logic chip with proprietary architecture, memory chips are largely standardized. Every manufacturer produces the same basic product, and customers buy on price and availability. That means competition in memory is not about differentiation. It's about who can produce the cheapest gigabyte. The companies that manufacture most efficiently at the greatest scale have an enormous advantage. But when prices fall, everyone falls together, and the company with the highest fixed cost base bleeds the most. Samsung exploited this dynamic deliberately. During the crashes of the 1990s and 2000s, while competitors cut budgets, reduced capacity, and tried to wait out the downturn with minimal damage, Samsung did the opposite. It invested through the downturns, intentionally flooding the market with supply to drive prices so low that weaker players couldn't survive long enough to see the recovery. This wasn't reactive, it was strategic. The explicit goal was to outlast competitors until they ran out of capital and folded. This ruthless counter-cyclical approach bankrupted Commanda, one of Europe's largest chip manufacturers, in 2009. It contributed to the collapse of Elpida in 2012, Japan's last major DRAM producer. With each exit, Samsung's share of the global memory market grew. Left standing alongside Samsung were SK Hynix and Micron, and nothing else with meaningful scale. That concentration of the market in the hands of three companies is not a coincidence. It is the intended outcome of Samsung's willingness to absorb short-term losses on a scale that only a highly diversified conglomerate with cash flowing from other divisions could sustain. Now, understanding why Samsung's cost structure is so heavy requires one concept that most people overlook: depreciation. When Samsung builds a new semiconductor factory, that $30 billion investment doesn't appear on the income statement all at once. It gets capitalized on the balance sheet and recognized as depreciation expense over the useful life of the factory, typically somewhere between 10 and 20 years. That depreciation is a real cost, appearing on every income statement for the life of the asset. And because the machinery inside those factories becomes technologically obsolete faster than the building depreciates, the effective cost burden is even heavier than the accounting suggests. A factory must run at near maximum utilization to absorb its depreciation cost and remain economically justified. Every percentage point of idle capacity directly erodes gross margin. This is why Samsung's profitability is so sensitive to demand. The cost of the factory is fixed. The revenue it generates is not connecting. All of this produces a coherent picture of Samsung's cash machine. It begins with manufacturing scale, which enables technology investment, which produces components, which feed consumer products, which reach global distribution networks, which generate revenue, which funds more investment, which creates greater scale. The cycle is self-reinforcing when demand is strong. And because the company operates multiple engines simultaneously, semiconductors, displays, smartphones, consumer electronics, automotive, a weakness in one division can be partially offset by strength in another. A bad year for consumer smartphones may coincide with a strong year for enterprise server memory. A downturn in television sales doesn't slow the component business if data center demand is accelerating. The diversification isn't accidental. It's structural shock absorption built into the company's architecture over decades. But Samsung's dual role as supplier and competitor creates tensions that occasionally become visible. For years, Samsung manufactured the A-series processors that Apple used in iPhones. This puts Samsung in the strange position of producing the most critical component inside its primary smartphone competitor's flagship device. The relationship was lucrative. Apple paid Samsung enormous sums for chip manufacturing services, but it also meant Samsung was directly funding the development of hardware that competed with Galaxy phones. Eventually, Apple moved A-series production to TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, which had developed an advanced packaging technology that made chips thinner and faster. But the broader point is this: Samsung has to constantly navigate the tension between maximizing component revenue from the industry and protecting the proprietary advantages that strengthen its own products. Sometimes those goals align, sometimes they directly conflict. This conflict also explains something important about the strategic bet Samsung didn't make in software. In late 2004, a startup founder named Andy Rubin walked into Samsung's headquarters in Seoul and pitched an operating system he was building. 6 people. Early stage. The executives listened, and then they laughed. They literally laughed him out of the boardroom, reportedly asking him, "You in what army?" Weeks later, Google acquired Andy Rubin's company for $50 million. The company was Android, the operating system that now powers roughly 3/4 of all smartphones on Earth. Samsung's phones run on Android. Its biggest strategic vulnerability, dependence on a third-party software ecosystem it doesn't control, was set in motion by a decision to not write a check for $50 million in 2004. That's the context for understanding why Samsung cannot simply become Apple. Its competitive advantages are built on a hardware foundation, and trying to abandon that foundation to chase software margins would mean walking away from the manufacturing scale and vertical integration that keep its semiconductor and display factories economically viable. The path that was always available to Apple was closed to Samsung the moment Andy Rubin walked out of that boardroom. And now the industry Samsung built itself around is being restructured by something that changes the underlying economics of every technology business on Earth. AI changes the semiconductor economy in a specific and important way. The processing demands of large language models and generative AI systems require enormous amounts of parallelized computation and highly specialized memory, particularly a product called high bandwidth memory, or HBM, which stacks DRAM chips vertically to deliver data to processors faster than conventional memory allows. This is not a minor upgrade to existing chip architecture. It represents a fundamental shift in what the most valuable semiconductor products actually are. The AI boom created a sudden, massive surge in demand for exactly the kind of components Samsung manufactures. In 2025, Samsung reported record revenues, driven significantly by enterprise memory and AI infrastructure demand. The DS division alone generated over 130 trillion Korean won, a number that makes the smartphone business look almost modest by comparison. But the AI story is not an automatic win for Samsung. Competitor SK hynix moved aggressively into HBM technology earlier and captured the position of primary memory supplier to NVIDIA during the initial generative AI boom, a relationship worth enormous sums in premium revenue at margins well above conventional DRAM. Samsung's HBM yields lagged. Qualification delays cost it preferred supplier status with the most important customer in the AI infrastructure buildout. The company that once used scale and early investment to dominate memory markets found itself in the unfamiliar position of catching up rather than leading in the product that will define the next decade. So the battles ahead are multi-front and genuinely uncertain. In semiconductors, Samsung has to close the gap in AI memory and advanced logic manufacturing while continuing to spend tens of billions annually to remain competitive with TSMC, which has a significant lead in the most advanced chip processes. In smartphones, Galaxy has to defend its premium position against Apple from above and absorb competitive pressure from Chinese manufacturers, Xiaomi, Oppo, Huawei, who are improving rapidly from below. In displays, Samsung's OLED leadership is real but not permanent, as competitors improve yield rates and close the technology gap. In AI specifically, the question of whether Samsung can reclaim memory leadership from SK hynix while also competing for advanced chip manufacturing orders is the central strategic question of the next 5 years. None of these are guaranteed wins, and the capital required to pursue them simultaneously is staggering. But Samsung has been here before, not just in downturns, in moments where the company looked overextended, overcommitted, outmaneuvered. In 1983, when industry leaders said semiconductor manufacturing was beyond Samsung's capability. In the early 1990s, when memory prices crashed and the strategy looked like a catastrophic mistake. In the mid-2000s, when the smartphone era threatened to make Samsung's hardware focus irrelevant. Each time, the company's ability to sustain investment through the difficult period and emerge with more scale and more capability than it entered with is what defined the outcome. That willingness was most famously codified in 1993, when Chairman Lee Kun-hee, frustrated with complacency inside the organization, gathered his executives in Frankfurt and delivered one of the most quoted directives in corporate history: change everything except your wife and children. The underlying philosophy wasn't inspirational rhetoric. It was an operational doctrine. Treat capital expenditure as an offensive weapon. Invest through cycles when competitors retreat. Absorb short-term losses to create long-term competitive distance. And never confuse the appearance of success with structural resilience. That doctrine is the true source of Samsung's economic moat. Not the phones, not the brand, not the marketing. The moat is built from scale, manufacturing depth, capital endurance, and a corporate culture that treats aggressive investment during downturns not as recklessness, but as competitive strategy. Before we wrap up, I want to let you know about the detailed business guides available in the description below and in the first pinned comment. If this is the kind of strategic and financial thinking you want to go deeper on, they're well worth checking out. So the final mental model for Samsung is not a phone company. It's not a television company. It's not even a semiconductor company, though that's the closest approximation of where its economic center of gravity actually sits. Samsung is a collection of interconnected technology businesses operating across multiple layers of the hardware supply chain simultaneously. Some of those businesses are booming when others are struggling. The memory division can be generating enormous profits, while the smartphone division fights a brutal margin war against Apple from one side and Chinese manufacturers from the other. The display business can be offsetting weakness in consumer electronics when OLED demand from third-party device makers is strong. The semiconductor division can be absorbing losses during a memory glut, while the consumer business holds the overall balance sheet together. The diversification isn't just about reducing risk in the traditional sense. It's about ensuring that the cash generation required to fund the next cycle of multi-trillion, capital investment never completely dries up. The conglomerate model isn't a legacy structure Samsung never got around to dismantling. It's load-bearing architecture that makes the entire investment strategy possible. And that's the real question that determines whether Samsung's next 50 years look anything like its last 50. The technology industry is migrating value from physical hardware to intelligent software and specialized AI infrastructure. The advantages that won the hardware era, scale, manufacturing efficiency, vertical integration, capital endurance, may not translate cleanly into the AI era, where value is created by the models trained on the hardware rather than the hardware itself. Samsung can manufacture the chips and the memory that AI runs on, but it doesn't own the models. It doesn't own the platforms. It doesn't own the software ecosystems that are increasingly where the most durable margins accumulate. Samsung didn't become a technology giant by making one perfect product. It built an economic machine capable of making thousands of products, billions of components, and enormous investments work together across decades of brutal cycles. The question now is whether that machine, built for a world where hardware was the prize, can survive a revolution where the prize is moving somewhere Samsung has never been able to follow. If you found this breakdown valuable, please like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps us keep making content like this. Thanks for watching.